Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, banker bashing is becoming quite fashionable, but we were first. Stacy?
Well, Max, take a look at this artwork that really captures the essence of the global financial system. A clockwork LIBOR. Yes, that's Bob Diamond there, of course, in the position of Alex from Clockwork Orange. And, you know, is bankers doing the ultra-violent on our global financial system, whether it's rigging interest rates, rigging municipal bond markets, rigging. That's all they know how to do.
It is violence. It's a form of violence. It's a form of ultra-violence. And this is the biggest concept that people have trouble getting their mind around, is because they think these are victimless crimes. They don't see them as being particularly egregious. And yet they are really the 21st century version of the pogroms we saw in the last century. The incredible devastation that was done using traditional means of warfare, tanks and guns and soldiers. This is violence committed by accounting fraud, securities fraud, currency wars, and the result are the same. You've got a concentrated group of folks trying to grab most of the world's assets, and the rest of the people are suffering austerity and dying and starving. And it's the same thing played out with different weapons. These are financial weapons.
Yes, you have the likes of Bob Diamond and Jamie Dimon. I almost confused their names there for a second. And Lloyd Blankfein. And, you know, every single banker, the head banker there, they're walking around like these droogs, like kicking the head in of our global financial system, of our banking system, of our derivative system. Every single thing, the integrity, the trust is gone because they're walking around kicking the head in.
Right, and having worked on Wall Street myself, this is how I have the insight into the mentality of these brokers like Diamond or Blankfein, is that they're purposefully committing acts of financial violence. They speak of ripping clients' faces off. You know, trades are executed. The clients get their heads ripped open. You know, this is the way they think. This is the way they treat their customers. Like they assassinate them and they steal their money.
Well, but in response to them doing the ultra-violent, we see yet another fake inquiry into the hardcore ultra-violent crimes of the banking system. And yet I think we need to turn to the Keiser technique. We should make Bob Diamond force his eyes open to watch Keiser Report and all the ultra-violent crimes he has done.
Yes, Alex in Clockwork Orange is the good model for Bob Diamond. Sit him down in a chair, prop open his eyes with wires, and let some eye drops flow in there occasionally, and make him watch all 306 episodes of Keiser Report back to back and see if that can't re-educate him.
Now, one of the bits, the elements, the important ingredients to this conspiracy that has been ongoing over the last few years is the Serious Fraud Office. And Max Keiser, you've been at the forefront of really going after them. Here's a tweet from the Telegraph. Breaking: Serious Fraud Office considering whether to bring criminal charges over LIBOR rigging, #rate rigging. So in a subsequent thing, they said they're going to decide in the next month whether or not to pursue criminal charges.
Right, the Serious Fraud Office has been suggesting their involvement in investigating and prosecuting financial crimes for many years now. They don't seem to get around to it.
And again, because they never get around to it, just like in A Clockwork Orange, the authorities, there was no authority there to come to the rescue of the population. And it was the man whose wife was raped by this group of droogs, that he's the one that did the Ludwig technique on Alex, and he forced him to watch violent crimes. And somebody's going to have to force these bankers to see the violent financial crimes, the ultra-violent they've been committing.
Well, I've seen on Twitter references to, is this the banking industry's Millie Dowler moment? And of course, this refers to the Murdoch phone hacking scandal, where people didn't think that listening to celebrity phone calls was particularly a big issue. But then when the Millie Dowler incident occurred, where this poor child was abused unmercifully by Rupert Murdoch and his minions of illegal spying, then the whole tide of investigation turned. Now, will this be the moment when suddenly the public wakes up to something we've been saying here for years, that they're being unconscionably disabused of any thought of a fair system where they can actually aggregate wealth without having it being stolen by the likes of Jamie Dimon or Bob Diamond or Lloyd Blankfein or the rest?
And now, Max, let's turn back a year and a half to the Serious Fraud Office. Headline reads, Budget Cuts Killed Off LIBOR Inquiry. So Britain's premier anti-corruption agency refused to carry out a criminal investigation into alleged manipulation of the benchmark LIBOR bank lending rate because it did not have enough money to fund it. SFO chiefs complain that their ability to investigate cases has been compromised by cuts to their budget, which fell from £51 million in 2008-2009 to £33 million this year, and is set to fall to £29 million by 2014-15.
Right. Well, this is a typical trick used by government to make sure that their crony buddies in the City of London or on Wall Street don't go to jail, is that they defund the regulatory agencies responsible to investigate. Same thing with the SEC in the United States. You know, the FSA and the Serious Fraud Office, they don't have the resources to prosecute crimes.
But isn't there some duty to tell the population, hey, we don't have any money, but I want to tell you there's a major crime going on that somebody should investigate it. Perhaps you, the population, might want to give us more money, or convince your politicians to give us more money to investigate this ongoing crime. But remember, this is a 35% collapse in funding from 2008, when there was quite a lot of evidence of a financial crime wave sweeping the world.
I told David Mitchell on 10 o'clock live, approximately a year ago. And I told him explicitly that these criminal acts were taking place. And of course, David Mitchell and the rest of the panel on that show, who's been indoctrinated in this notion that bankers are gods and we can't possibly question what they're doing. You see the response is pathetic.
Well, let's turn to a clip of that, Max, because here David Mitchell has asked you whether reforms will help.
You've got cancerous bankers in the system corrupting the system. You've got to get rid of this cancer.
Okay, so what, in this banking, these banking reforms, how has that addressed that and how has it failed to address that?
It doesn't matter what the reform is because you've got no regulatory agency who's willing to put anyone in jail. During the last major scandal, the S&L crisis in the United States, you had 1,800 bankers went to jail.
Look,
this time you've got none, except maybe Bernie Madoff.
Okay, so
you've got nothing.
So enough.
No, there's got to be serious prosecution. They're committing serious crimes.
Goodness
They're
sake.
stealing money.
You're just talking la la la.
And the point I make is that there is no money in the regulatory agencies to effectuate reform by design, because there's a collusion between the regulations agencies, the City of London, and the government, and this is quite clear.
Well, more important than that, Max, is they have to be thrown in jail. If the guy is doing the ultra-violent on the global financial system, he needs to go to jail or have the Keiser technique.
Well, there has to be a deterrent in place to deter criminal behavior. And David Cameron, when he's very quick to say that when the looters were out there stealing 4-pound bottles of soda, that they should be sent to jail even though they were 10 or 12 years old. But when confronted with the unequivocal evidence that Bob Diamond and his crew at Barclays have been stealing millions and colluding with the Bank of England to rig interest rates on the LIBOR front, he's not sure whether this requires a response or not. And that's why his society over there in Britain is collapsing in front of his eyes. That's why the economy can't grow, is because there's this asymmetric approach to law and justice, where if you're rich and you're a crony of Cameron, there's one set of laws. If you're somebody else, then, oh, that's a totally separate set of laws.
You know, speaking of this, the Clockwork Orange, I want to talk about another droog who we might call a moob. Tony Blair says he is interested in another term as Prime Minister. I thought you would like this one, Max. Tony Blair said he would like another stint as Prime Minister, although he accepts it is not very likely to happen. In an interview with the Evening Standard, which he was guest editing for the day, Mr. Blair made clear that he would like another job in public service.
Well, he's leveraged his time at number 10 to go do oil patch deals. He claimed there was no blood for oil in the Iraqi war. That's been proven that there was blood for oil, and now he's still thirsty. That's the problem when you have a bloodthirsty waraholic, a violent person like Tony Blair, who's by nature extremely violent. They're never satisfied.
But importantly, Max, let's turn back to that Channel 4 clip, because here you're saying that the banks and the government are the same
The regulator is controlled by the government. There is no doubt that the regulator...
The government is owned by the banks!
Oh, rubbish.
Absolutely!
Listen, we're now moving into conspiracy theory nonsense.
Okay, Tony Blair now makes £3 million a year as a JP Morgan executive. He also works for a Swiss bank as well. But listen, we have heads of Goldman Sachs in all sorts of governments across Europe. So that guy on the Channel 4 thing who said it was a conspiracy theory, that there's no collusion between banksters and government.
Well, the LIBOR scandal shows the Bank of England is rigging markets. Okay, so I don't know what more you need to be aghast at how corrupt this global system has become. We know what happens with the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington. It's happening with Mervyn King and Bank of England in the UK. They're colluding with Bob Diamond to rig markets on a $300 trillion plus a market, you know, so this is beyond just mere fiddling of the books. This is a wholesale Pearl Harbor attack on the financial system.
The ultra-violent. Now, I bring up Tony Blair because he's also in the news for Blair defends PFI as NHS trusts face bankruptcy. Now, notice that anywhere a banker is running things, whatever system they touch turns to bankruptcy. Tony Blair has defended the spread of private finance initiatives under Labour as 7 NHS trusts face administration as they struggle to repay large debts from PFI deals. So the scheme saw private firms building hospitals, leaving the NHS with basically a mortgage and an annual fee to pay over 30 years. The total value of the NHS buildings built by Labour under the scheme is $11.4 billion, but the bill basically, Max, comes down to $70 billion.
All right, it's equity extraction.
Yeah.
They load the system up with debt, they pay themselves a huge dividend, and then expose the entire system to any fluctuation in interest rates, which of course are inevitable, and then it goes bankrupt. It's the Philip Green model over there at Arcadia, if you recall. He paid himself a £1 billion dividend by loading the company up with debt paid to his wife in Monaco, and then of course he's totally exposed to the vagaries of interest rates.
But when confronted with this information on Sky News, Tony Blair said that the contribution PFI had made to rebuilding the country's infrastructure was immense. He said PFI has been copied around the world.
Right. Of course, it's because it's a disease. It's a financial disease that's infected the financial departments and treasury departments of governments all over the world who see an easy way to pay themselves huge bucks and pass the burden and the risk on to the citizens through socializing the risk, privatizing the gains. You see people look at Tony Blair and they say, look, if he can do it, if he can steal all this money from everybody, why can't we do it? And of course it's copied around the world.
Well, I might add that the Miami cannibal, the zombie who ate the face of a homeless man, he was copied around the world. It doesn't make a good thing.
Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to New York City. Talk with Reggie Middleton of BoomBustBlog.com. Reggie, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, sir. As usual, it's always good to be back.
All right, Reggie Middleton, let's talk about French banks. You see them as the next most likely to fail into a black hole of debt-consuming economics and banking systems around the world. Talk to me about the French banks.
To be honest, the French banks have an awful lot of competition as to who's going to fall. You know, it's a race with a lot of competitors, but it's not as if the French banks are not the front runners. France is one of the nominally 2 strongest economies in Western Europe, or in the EU, shall I say, accompanied by Germany. But France has a lot of secrets. For instance, their banking system is much larger than the sovereign state that the banks are domiciled in, which is France itself. If you take the assets, the levered assets of the French banks, it's larger than the GDP of France by a multiple. I mean, not simply 1 or 1 times larger, but significantly larger. Combine that with the fact that the French banks and France itself is heavily levered into Italy, and Italy has its own funding issues with its funding rates at historical highs. You can see where there's significant stress or potential calamity in the French banking system. As Italy goes, so does France, or the French banks, levered several times. Now, if the French banks fail, you know, France, as a socialist nation, will do the bailout thing, much like the U.S. and the UK and Greece and practically everybody else, Portugal. The issue is, how do you bail out something that's significantly larger than yourself? You know, It's as if Reggie Milton with $100 in the bank decides to bail out J.P. Morgan itself. You know, can I do it? You know, I can say I could do it. I could put headlines out. I could cause a significant spike in the equity market as momentum traders chase prices versus value. But at the end of the day, you have a disconnect. And that's what I see for the French banking system in general.
Okay, so you bring up this interesting point. How do you bail out something with the debts are bigger than the entire country's GDP? Now, doesn't this expand a little bit to this developing scandal out of London involving LIBOR? And what I mean by this is that these banks have been allowed to grow their balance sheets to considerably bigger than the GDP of the countries that host these banks. Concomitantly, we see a collusion going on. We now know it's between the emails between Barclays and Bank of England. There's collusion going on to keep the LIBOR rates and other interest rates artificially cheap as a way to allow the growth of this extraordinary debt to continue. Same thing is true at the Federal Reserve Bank and banks in the United States, correct?
Yes, you know, it's a different mechanism in cheapening the rates, but it's exactly the same. It's the same goal. The rates in the U.S. At close to zero and negative is preposterous, considering, you know, the fundamentals in the macro situation, and the same thing with Europe. The LIBOR scandal, I guess you'd call it, collusion, is quite interesting because if you take a look at the UK banks' CDS rates, you see there's nowhere in the world they can actually borrow at LIBOR, at the LIBOR that's quoted. So that should draw attention as to why would LIBOR be that cheap. And if you take a look at the communications and even the anonymous insiders' comments, you know, it's widespread that they would lower the LIBOR rates artificially, and everybody's in the room. The management was on board, the economists were on board, risk managers were on board, the bankers, the traders, the structured product guys, everybody. So it's not as if this was hidden, and all the banks did it, and they would do it daily. They'd artificially lower the LIBOR rate daily. Now, this also begs into the question, why is there no watchdog? Why is there no oversight? You know, what the central bank would do is they'd ask for a LIBOR rate. The bank would say, write it down on a piece of paper, here it is. You know, so are bankers now able to be trusted to that extent? You know, rhetorical question, of course. And then you artificially suppress the LIBOR rates, but the actual LIBOR rates are that much higher. And then you force your clients or push your clients into a higher rate off of the base rate, knowing that you automatically you synthetically suppress the LIBOR rate, knowing that the real LIBOR rate is higher. So I would think at the end of the day, any corporate clients of the bank that had to pay a higher rate, you know, should have some type of compensatory damages.
Let me stick on this point a little bit. So on one hand, you're saying of all the banks around the world that are involved in dodgy dealings, the French banks look particularly vulnerable. And this is really interesting because in context, of course, you've done a lot of work in looking at J.P. Morgan's balance sheet in the United States and shown how vulnerable that balance sheet is. And then within a few months, Jamie Dimon had to agree with Reggie Middleton and say, yes, our balance sheet is completely fraudulent. We've got billions of dollars in losses. And all they had to do was look at Boom Bust Blog, and he would have seen that months ago. But of all those banks in the world, the French banks look the most vulnerable to you. But you just said something a second ago. I wanted you to explore it a little bit more. You're saying that the CDS rates, the credit default swap rates, were such that they could not even take advantage of these artificially low LIBOR rates. And the point or the question I want to ask is, isn't it true that when you're looking for fraud in these markets, it's staring you right in the face, correct?
If you're looking for it, yes. You know, the key is you have to look for it. You know, in the banking system, when it's a I scratch your back, you scratch mine situation, you know, if one entity looks for it, he causes trouble for many of the other entities along the food chain. So if you look for it, you'll be ostracized. You'll probably end up like many of the traders who got caught. Many of the traders who were blamed for these multi-billion-dollar banking losses. It's interesting when you have $2, $3, $4, $5 billion banking loss, and they accuse a junior trader, you know, of causing such a significant loss. Let's take the best case scenario and say that's true. What kind of risk management systems do you have in a world-class bank where you have a junior trader that could take a $2 or $3 billion loss. You know, it's absolutely outrageous. The key is that if you take a look at all the market mechanisms that are unfettered by the ability of the bank to affect pricing, such as the CDS market, or such as the actual bond markets, you see that the market thinks that the bank should be paying a significantly higher rate than the banks say they are paying. So that in itself is an indication of potential fraud. Now, you can investigate it to see if it's fraudulent or not, but it's very difficult to manipulate a bond market or a currency market because it is so large, so deep, so wide, and so liquid. In order to manipulate it, you have to have significant capital. You know, more capital than most banks, or the economic capital than most banks are privy to. So if I was looking for the truth, looking for a fraudulent act, I start with a purely market-based pricing mechanism and work my way forward.
You know, Reggie, what I find shocking is that, you know, if you look at, let's say, professional tennis, for example, they have computers and machinery and cameras that'll show when the ball falls outside of the allowed court committing a foul. And a foul is generated, the call is computer generated. And you said, the reason I ask this is you say, well, the fraud is there if you want to look at it. The fraud is there if any regulator at all simply set their computer to alert them anytime LIBOR rate was significantly at disconnect with CDS rates, it would signal fraud. It would take 5 minutes to do this, and it would take virtually no cost to implement. So it's not about just not looking for fraud. It's about racketeering, isn't it? It's about regulators involved in a racket where they're engaged with the banks and the regulators and the government and the fund managers to rig these markets as part of a global racketeering, correct?
You know, in a nutshell, one of my earliest, I think the first appearance on your show, I went over the term regulatory capture. And that's basically an instance where the regulators are actually captured by those who they regulate. You cannot effectively regulate if those who you are supposed to be regulating have any type of influence over you, whether it's economic, political, social, and any other influence. It is impossible to regulate. Now, I'm not going to say that the regulators have been purchased, bought off, politically influenced, etc. But, you know, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, you know, sounds like a duck, smells like a duck, and looks like a duck, you know, is it an ostrich? You know, it's really just that simple. As you clearly stated, you know, you can take a look at disconnect between, you know, the market-based mechanisms and what's actually quoted. And when you see a spread, you know, you should look into it. The fact that nobody's bothered to do this, I think the LIBOR scandal was brought to light by a reporter or a journalist, which is ridiculous. You know, reporter and journalists are doing their jobs as regulators now, or blogs, or the Max Keiser show. So, you know, what we need is a complete blow-up of the system and a restart. And when you do that, you have fresh blood in, you have different incentives, and hopefully the incentives as they grow are not distorted to the point where people are rewarded for a lack of economic growth, which is what we have now, versus a capitalistic system where you're rewarded for basically creating economic profit and capital.
All right, so finally, let's just talk on these French banks again. There's two primary banks here in France. You've got BNP, you've got Société Générale. Is it safe to say that both of these banks are as insolvent as JP Morgan?
If you mark everything in the market, you know, insolvency is my call. BNP, like I said, is heavily levered into Italy. Italy goes bust, that's roughly half of BNP's net equity. And that's just Italy. That's just Italy. If you take a look at the losses that BNP had to write down in terms of Greece, and Greece is a very, very small sliver, right, of what of BNP's net equity. Okay, Italy is a significant portion. So if Italy goes bust, right, and needs a bailout, BNP basically has lost half of its net equity right there. And that's just Italy. Chances are if Italy needs a bailout, many of the sovereign nations are going to move in tandem. So, you know, that 50% is actually going to be significantly lower. Okay, now how does BNP get bailed out by France? Because if BNP goes, chances are the other French banks are going to move in tandem. So France, as a socialist nation, will of course move to bail out the banking system versus ring fencing, you know, the essential banking services, and then let everything else, you know, be taken care of by the markets. But that's the way it should be done. I can almost guarantee that's the way it will not be done. So all the BNP bad assets and debts will now be loaded upon the French balance sheet, to be taken on by the French taxpayers, which would make France insolvent, just as insolvent as the French banking system, which was hit by the potential or actual insolvency of Italy. So you can see the contagion chain, and you can see how you have a sniffle that becomes the flu, that becomes a potential death of certain banks and the sovereign states that they're in. Of course, the sovereign state, in my opinion, cannot go bankrupt, but it can have to be forced to reset, which is the case with Iceland, and that should be the goal, because if you take a look at Iceland, one of the fastest growing countries in Iceland, in the EU, has been Iceland, and the reason is because they forced the reset of the system.
Okay, Reggie Middleton, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
You're very welcome, Max, and look forward to coming back.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Reggie Middleton of Boom Bust Blog. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Till next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.